Well, good morning or good afternoon on this first day of fall, and welcome to our webinar today on Globalization 2.0, A Path to German-American Prosperity. I'm Peter Rashish. I'm the director of the Geoeconomics program at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. I'm glad that you've all chosen to join us today, and I'm also very pleased that we have such top-notch speakers on our panel today. As we look at the question we will address, we see that economies around the world are recovering from COVID-19 and from the disruptions that it provoked, but that they are facing new challenges that seem to be calling into question the effectiveness of the existing international economic order as we've known it for at least 75 years. And so today we'd like to examine if a new kind of order, if a new globalization 2.0 with updated guidelines for trade, for investment, climate, and technology would better promote US, German, and broader European values and prosperity at a time when we particularly see national security and economics becoming much more intertwined. We'll also explore whether the institutions we have, such as the World Trade Organization, are up to the task of advancing transatlantic prosperity, or whether we need to focus on new arrangements with different rules or issues or members. Today's webinar is part of a broader AI-CGS project on the importance of the transatlantic partnership in times of global crises, and it's funded by the European Recovery Program of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. Let me now introduce today's panelists. Fran Burwell is a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council, where until January of 2017, she served as Vice President of European Union and Special Initiatives, and where she currently directs the Transatlantic Digital Marketplace Initiative. She is also a Senior Director at McClarty Associates. Jacob Kirkegaard is a Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund in Brussels, which he joined in September 2020, and at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, where he has worked since 2002. During his career, he has also worked with the Danish Ministry of Defense, the United Nations in Iraq, and in the private financial sector. And Stormy-Annika Mildner is Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Germany in Berlin and an adjunct lecturer at the Hertie School of Governance there. Before coming to Aspen, she served as Head of Department for External Economic Policy at the Federation of German Industries, and earlier worked at the German Council on Foreign Relations and the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, or SWP as it is often known. We will hear from each panelist for 7 to 10 minutes or so, and then I will moderate a discussion among them, following which we'll open it up to questions from you. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A button, which you can see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get those to the panelists. So to start, let me hand it over to you, Fran Burwell.
Thanks very much, Peter. I wanted to start with a comment that you made that after COVID, we were emerging from the global economy was starting to reemerge. But I think that what we have to recognize is that the global economy that is emerging is a very different global economy. And in particular, if you look back to when the institutions that manage the global economy were founded, the WTO was one of the last, the most recent founding, and that was 1995. So I think that since that point, and particularly, if you will, the highlight of the Bretton Woods systems, the 1980s or so, at that point, the global economy was basically about trade and goods. Trade and services was just starting to take off. And the trade conflicts of the time were about soybeans, hormone-fed beef, dolphin tuna, and of course, everyone's favorite chlorinated chicken. Agriculture and the food industry now, though, is only 5% of US GDP. And if I could break it down more specifically, I would suspect that food industry is a lot more than agriculture in that. Um, at that time, our outstanding issues were about market access and WTO rules. The Airbus-Boeing conflict comes from that era. Today, however, the US-EU digital market is among the largest in the world. And what we have really seen in the global economy is the digital transformation. The global economy, the areas of growth are the transfer of digitally enabled services, goods ordered online, and global investment by tech companies that provide services around the world. This is not so much about market access as it is about investment, as it is about very technologically based issues such as data transfers, cloud services, and algorithms. Those are the pressure points in the global economy and also in the transatlantic economy. The second transformation is more recent, but I think very strong at the political level, and that's the reawakening of economic nationalism. Governments were already struggling with the impact of trade on some constituencies. We had a lot of concern already about China and its predatory practices in the global economy. And then COVID just demonstrated how weak some of our supply chains were. We also, of course, had the semiconductor supply chain issue. And now the Russian invasion of Ukraine has highlighted how vulnerable we are on some critical minerals issues. So governments are trying to wrestle with how do you keep supply chains and your economies resilient, but not totally abandon the liberal trading order from which, let's be frank, the West has benefited for a long time. It's key to the success and prosperity of the West. One answer to this might be to refocus on restoring the WTO. There's a lot that could be done there, but I have to say that there's no enthusiasm for this in the current US administration. We just are not seeing that happen. Even if we did, however, I think that a lot of the conflicts that we are seeing are just not WTO related. They are different. They're not just part of trade market access. And the WTO was never as strong at getting rid of behind the border barriers, non-tariff barriers to trade. Those were always very difficult. Instead, what I would suggest it's time to explore is to build what I would call a democratic digital community based on sharing sovereignty among like-minded governments. It should be structured to encourage competition, but provide resilience in a more hostile geopolitical environment. Some key questions that we would have to wrestle with. What's the shape of the community? And I would say that it is not a global institution. That would take 20 years to negotiate and would be outmoded by the time it was constructed. Rather, a network of arrangements, some of which will be binding and some voluntary. Who is in? Well, I think there's a lot of self-selection, a lot of variable geometry. A lot of governments will decide on a few things and not other things. I do think that over time, a core of countries will emerge and they might want to go farther. The complexity of issues is also a real challenge. We are talking about priority issues such as privacy and the management of personal data, disinformation, cybersecurity, rules for trustworthy AI, management of non-personal data. And then finally, different regulatory approaches. In some sense, the horse has already left the barn. The EU has started to set up a comprehensive and rigorous regulatory system. Some would say too rigorous. The UK and Japan are exploring how to take that system and be more flexible. And the US, quite frankly, has not really constructed a comprehensive approach toward the issues of the digital economy. So what would be the goals of such a network? And I think those would be protection of citizens, resilience of systems, avoidance of additional barriers. A digital market as open as possible and backed by democratic values. So how do you get there? And in the last couple minutes, I just want to say there are a lot of plurilateral arrangements that are already either in process or have been signed. And the question is, how do you deepen them? So the Christchurch call on non-terrorist content, the stalled WTO e-commerce agreement, APEC cross-border privacy rules, but two in particular, just as examples, I want to focus on. The first is data free flow with trust, which has been something discussed in the G7, the G20 and G7. It acknowledges the importance of the free flow of data, which is under challenge right now, and however looks at some of the challenges that that brings. The G7 under the UK started focusing this down more on data localization or avoiding data localization, looking for commonalities in regulation that could be used for building blocks of something more important. Government access to data for law enforcement and data sharing in specific sectors. And I think that there is a possibility here of moving forward in negotiations on specific things that could help construct, put more meat on the bones of the idea of data free flow with trust. And then the Declaration on the Future of the Internet. 60 countries have signed this, plus the European Commission, clearly intended to rally democracies in the face of techno-authoritarians. It has general principles, that's what it is. But now the question is, how do you deepen it? The administration is focused on widening it, getting more signatories. I would say don't do that. Instead, let's look at what benchmarks can we create that would actually make protecting human rights online something that is in our regulations across all the signatories. So that's a tough order, but I think that's deepening is how we have to go. TTC, my last remark, is a place where we can have these discussions bilaterally with the EU. And I think it's very clear that the US and the EU, if they don't agree, it's going to be very hard to move ahead with this type of democratic digital community. So I am hopeful that the TTC will start to turn some of its attention to these issues. Let me stop there.
And thank you. Let me hand it over now to Jacob Kirkegaard.
Well, thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to join you today. I want to talk about three main issues in my introductory remarks. The first one is going to be decarbonization. Then I want to give a, judging from when I have said this in other forums, in the eyes of many, an alternative view on China. And then I want to talk about education at the end. But starting with decarbonization, where obviously right now there's a lot of talk about, particularly in Europe, you know, the reintroduction of a lot of coal-fired power plants, etc., and additional emissions to overcome the acute fallout from the war in Ukraine. But I would actually offer a relatively more optimistic scenario, particularly in a transatlantic setting, under the right set of circumstances. I think, first of all, I think it's very clear that on the European side, the current gas and power emergency is an enormous accelerator of the broader green agenda. Certainly I, and I think most people looking at it, are today far more optimistic about Europe reaching its 2030 carbon commitment goals than we were a year ago before the start of the war. And simply, we now have a political dynamic that says we have to do everything we can to exit Russian fossil fuels, to exit all fossil fuels. And that is a dynamic, that political coalition of basically environmentalists and realists, if you like, is going to be very difficult to stop. And when it comes to the rollout of renewable energy, the actually re-emergence outside of Germany of also nuclear power in the future is going to propel Europe in that direction. Meanwhile, of course, in the United States, we have seen the emergence or the creation, if you like, what I would call protectionist decarbonization. Basically, we have, with the passage of the IRA, obviously for the first time, a sizable commitment of federal resources promoting renewable energy, electric vehicles, etc. But, and this touches on many of the things that Fran just talked about, this has come at the cost of a considerable cost of additional protectionist measures, which I'm sure will play out in the WTO and the TTC and many other regional and bilateral forums. So this wasn't costless, but nonetheless, almost $400 billion in new federal money, 10 years of tax credit, or 12 years, I think, I forgot how much, for renewable energy. I believe it puts the United States on a much firmer path towards reaching the goals, the pretty ambitious goals put out at the beginning of the Biden administration. Now, going forward, of course, so basically, I think, we're getting in the right direction on both sides, both certainly in Germany and the EU and the United States on decarbonization. However, we are using different tools. In the EU, of course, it is predominantly price-based, the carbon price, emissions trading, etc. That's not happening, obviously, at the federal level in the United States. And there will, therefore, and I think this is the formative challenge, we can hope the TCC will be up to the job, namely to come up with a formula that de facto enables a carbon club between the EU and the United States, where basically the regulatory measures taken by the United States will be, if you like, translated into a shadow price of carbon, and there will be a transatlantic agreement for that. I would say that, obviously the hammer out there to make this happen is CBAM. It's coming on the European side, because one of the things we have not seen, despite the massive increases in energy costs, is a significant, there's been some decline in the price of carbon, but it's somewhere around 70 euros now per ton. So easily still very, very high, or certainly enough to require CBAM fulfill the view of the role that it does seen from Europe, namely leveling the carbon playing field globally. So this is obviously the forcing mechanism, if you like, for this to happen. But I don't think it should overshadow the fact that on both sides of the Atlantic, we are making, I believe, fairly important progress in our decarbonization struggle. Now, China. I think that the thing to know about China here at the cusp of the next National Party Congress and concerns about Taiwan and geopolitics and all of that is that I actually believe that the major change in China is already happening and it's unstoppable. And it is the dramatic slowdown in China's economic growth rate. There simply is, in my opinion, no way you can credibly construct a scenario today where Chinese long-term potential growth rate is more than 1.5 to 2%. Or in other words, not materially larger or higher than, at least in Northern Europe, or for that matter, the United States. And it's pretty simple, actually. Long-term potential growth rates are essentially the sum of the growth rate of the potential workforce, so the working age population. Unfortunately, in China, we know that parameter is going to decline by between 0.7 and 1% a year. The second component of a long-term potential growth rate is the growth rate of the capital stock. Now, the problem in China is that China has, for the last at least 12 years, 15 years, had an investment rate of GDP of 42 to 44% of GDP, historically unprecedented in any middle-income country. And it's therefore, in my opinion, not sustainable. And then finally, the third component of long-term growth rates are productivity. The problem is that in China, productivity, or TFP, has grown less than 1% a year since the year 2010, or the decade from 2010 to COVID hit was 0.7. You add those three components up, and you get something, if you're generous, of 1.5, maybe 2%. Or in other words, the end of Chinese economic convergence. Now, this has very important implications for Germany, because it means that China, the growth of the Chinese market is going to be a lot smaller going forward. So Germany needs to put far less emphasis on China, simply also as a matter of growth prospects. The growth ain't going to be there in the future, which calls for a pretty significant transition in many German companies. Of course, in the United States, the change is probably going to be even bigger, because the United States needs to get out of this idea that China is this unstoppable economic juggernaut that's going to take over the world, and we need to spend $800 billion a year in defense to counter it. We need to have a rational discussion about the real type of economic challenge that China poses in the long run, and it is not the one that is being conducted right now. I'm not saying that many of the practices that Fran talked about that China has been engaged in are things we should condone, but China isn't going to grow much faster than the rest of us in the long run. What this will mean is that I think the dominance of the West, quote unquote, the United States, Germany, and the EU, also in global economic institutions, is going to continue. It means we will still be called upon to lead many of these, whether it's the WTO or the IMF or whatever have you, but we have to obviously be careful not to seek to dominate them. So we need to come up with a more inclusive framework. And then finally, let me just also say that this is a medium to long run economic forecast that certainly means we shouldn't get overly agitated about this concern about inflation, because a China that grows along these metrics will take care of a lot of the inflationary pressures in the medium term. Then finally, on education, obviously, education and innovation or technology is always in a race. We know that right now it's AI, it's machine learning, etc. And of course, here the threat, if you like, or perception of a threat from China clearly also plays a role. But there's also now, post-pandemic, a different kind of educational transition or workforce upheaval, which is, of course, work from home. Doing basically what we're doing right now on this call. There, I think, we just need to be recognized and cognizant of the fact that work from home, or technologically enabled as it is a further driver of inequality. You might indeed argue that people like everybody on this call who can do a lot of their work from home, we should probably be taxed on that privilege relative to many people who are not able to do so. But then what it means is both the growth of work from home and the continued onslaught of AI means that there is continuously, I would say, a focus on the type of practical skills that are often embodied in apprenticeship training or non-academic training, which is, of course, something that Germany has traditionally excelled in, and something that has been at least attempted by some German companies in the United States to transplant that type of education also in the United States. I will just end up by saying that I think, given the level of broader inequality that we have in the world, and the rise of political populism on both sides of the anger, unless we get, on top of this continued educational challenge, we're going to jeopardize further the, if you like, outward and liberal economic outlook that has perhaps with the exception of the Trump years, generally characterized both sides of the Atlantic since World War II. So let me finish there.
Thank you, Jacob. Let me turn it over now to Stormy-Mildner.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Peter, for organizing this very timely event. Since one of the research big question you are asking in your project is about transatlantic relations and where we stand and where we are going, I thought that I might bring in the German perspective a little bit and try to shed some light on where we currently stand and where we are going, because there's so much happening here in Berlin. And I also thought that I might do so because, yes, on one hand side, EU trade policy is supranational. It is the job of the European Commission and the European Parliament, but the member states are pretty strong. And one of the member states who is a driver, and maybe should even be more of a driver for transatlantic economic integration, is Germany. So another reason for why to shed light on my country, and because I'm German, I thought I might bring in that perspective. And what I would like to do is first contextualize a little bit, also with regard to the Zeitenwende, the sea change in German foreign trade, if that is also the case for German trade and investment policy. Just remind us of a few facts and figures, what trade and investment mean to Germany, and then take a look at our new trade policy, which has been, or strategy, which has been put forward by our coalition government. And let me start with a quote from that Eckpunktepapier, so that strategy paper of the coalition government, because I think it says a lot where we are going. And it reads, particularly in view of the current crisis, we want to reduce dependence on individual countries and broaden both import countries and sales markets. Above all, we want to intensify cooperation and trade with countries with which we share fundamental values of liberal democracy. And to this end, we want to drive forward appropriate trade agreements on the basis of the most progressive EU trade agreement. By the way, I did translate that. And I hope it captures exactly what the German text says. So in February 24th, when Russia invaded Ukraine, a shockwave went through Germany and went through Europe. Obviously, we all remember this. Most of us did not believe that that would actually happen. Just a few days before that happened, most people here in Germany, analysts, politicians, business people, would say, well, we do have a mutual dependency on each other. Russia is dependent on our money and investment, and we are dependent on resources. And that creates a rationale which would keep Russia from invading Ukraine. Obviously, we were all wrong in this regard. I think a lot of us thought so because we grew up in a Europe, in a European Union, which is characterized as a big peace project where integration and economic integration really led to peace and stability. That's how I grew up, at least. And so we were strong believers of neoliberal institutionalism, so to say, right? Few of us were neo-realists. Most of us believed in the power of the markets and in the integrative power of trade and investment to prevent conflict and wars. And obviously for the EU, that's the case. But we projected this experience to many, many other countries, not just to Russia, but also to China. And so the shockwave was not only with regard to that this is the end of the peace order for the EU, for Europe, but also a shock to our belief system, I have to say. And a few days later, you all remember that Olaf Scholz held the now famous Zeitenwende speech, which was mostly concentrated on foreign and security issues, but which heralded a turning point in post-war European history, as well as for German foreign and security policy. And since then, it has really become blatantly clear that Germany is very dependent, or was very dependent on Russian gas, and that our energy policy was misled in a lot of aspects. And now our industry is struggling massively with high gas prices. Households haven't felt that so much yet because we had a long, nice, warm summer. But as soon as we're heading into the winter and the first energy bills are going to come in, also households are going to feel that. And Russia's cruel violation of international law and its human rights violations and everything what it is doing really also sharpened our eye for dependence on other difficult partners in the world, mostly China. You all know that we did have a slow change in China policy starting in 2016, but I would say that this has accelerated massively since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And now the whole narrative on trade is changing. Also on investment is changing. It is much more seen through a security lens. It is by many much more seen as a threat and a vulnerability than an asset. And diversification, stockpiling, new partnerships are really on everybody's mind. And in parts, that is a good thing because we are very, very dependent on individual countries. Sorry about that. Just as a reminder, our foreign trade ratio to GDP is 89% or almost 90% of GDP in 2021. That is really massive. And another indicator, the contribution of net exports to GDP, while it stood at 0.2% in 2000, it was 5.5% in 2021. And our trade surplus to GDP ratio amounted to 7.5% in 2021. That is also very, very massive. It is changing currently because of the high energy prices. And we did have a negative trade balance for the first time ever in May this year. But nonetheless, I mean, we are very, very trade dependent. And in parts, that's very good because it creates jobs, it creates welfare, income, and so on. But it does create vulnerabilities if we are too dependent on a few countries, both with regard to sales markets as well as with regard to import markets where we get our inputs. And if these countries are countries with huge political risks, as it is the case. I'm not saying that the European market isn't extremely important for us. It really is. 51% of our trade around 50% takes place within the European Union. But we don't get, as Francis pointed out, you mentioned rare earth and some metals and minerals. I mean, we are so dependent on China for this, both for extraction as well as processing. More than 90% of the rare earth which we use come from China, for example. So in a few very critical products, semiconductors is another issue. We are just so highly dependent. And that is reflected, coming back to the quote, which I read in the beginning. This had an impact on the new trade strategy put forward by our coalition government. And what you see in there, not everything is new, but there, I would say there are some new nuances in there. And if you are interested in this, I would also recommend looking at the speeches by Annalena Baerbock, which she gave at the meeting of the German ambassadors. There's a big German ambassadors conference every year, and she held 2 speeches there. One for her own ambassadors and one for business people. And in the first one, she talked a lot about the narrative of the West against the West, autocracies and democracies. And she was a little bit more cautious with this regard because it's obviously not as black and white. With regard to the second speech she gave, she focused very much on new partnerships, which have to be concluded, especially in the area of resources, but also in the area of technology. So what are the main priorities? It is still the WTO that is named first, and a reform and a strengthening of the WTO. New agreements are to be concluded, and the government showed openness to conclude to finally ratify CETA, the agreement with Canada, under certain circumstances, i.e. with a side letter, so to say, with specification with regard to the investment treaty. And what you see, if you look specifically into the CETA side texts, which the government designed or put forward, they're still very critical of regulatory cooperation and very critical of investment protection. Two issues where I would say the position has not changed so much in comparison to the past. But the issue of new agreements, that I would say is something where a lot more emphasis is placed on in the past. What does that all mean for the transatlantic relationship? I looked through all those documents and I did really not find a lot on the TTC. The TTC does reflect many of the things I just talked about, but it is not, what I did not find is that we are seeing our, or we in terms of the government is easily seeing the future in a super strengthened transatlantic relationship, but rather in diversification of partnerships. And I think the reason for this is the experience of the last 4 years with the Trump administration. Yes, there's been a restart of the transatlantic partnership and a lot has been achieved and great cooperation with regard to the sanctions towards Russia. That's all very, very positive. The whole tone, the whole atmosphere, everything has become more cooperative. But then you look into the CHIPS Act, then you look into the Inflation Reduction Act, and then you find Buy America in there, you find investment screening for outbound investment with extraterritoriality in there. So there are lots of conflicts still there. And the steel and aluminum conflict, the Airbus-Boeing conflict, they are put on hold, so to say, but not solved. And this all means that the government isn't putting all its eggs in one basket, but is also thinking about diversification. And I think this, I would at least say, and I'm closing with this, I wish we would put some more of our eggs into the TTC and into the transatlantic partnership and use the 2 years which we still have before you might have a change of government in the United States again to find some binding agreements, to deliver something in the TTC which is tangible and also enforceable. Because otherwise I'm afraid that lots can be turned again when we have a turn of government. So I close here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stormy. There's a lot that all three of you have raised. If I try to engage in the Herculean task of finding a common thread, and I don't want to step on the nuances that each of you had in your remarks. One thing I think I hear is that there's a tension perhaps between doing things at a multilateral level and doing things among a smaller group of participants. And there's a move towards the latter. There seems to be more comfort. Fran, you said that you framed that through technology. Jacob, I think you were in a way framing that on perhaps in terms of fighting climate change. And Stormy, I think when you talked about the German government, there was a sort of an aspect related to reorienting supply chains. So my question to all of you is, if we're moving in this direction where the WTO is still going to exist, but a lot of the energy is going to be put into things among like-minded countries, among smaller groups of countries. And let me just pause for a second to say that the thing about the WTO that I think I think a lot of us would agree is important, is that it's rooted in public international law. It has a legal basis, which gives it a sort of legitimacy in the international relations sense. Should we be worried that if we move away from putting energy in the WTO, put more energy into these smaller groups, should we be worried about the legitimacy that a climate club or a democratic technology club or sort of, kind of friendly, friend-shoring, let's say, should we be worried about the legitimacy that these kinds of ways of organizing international trade has or does not have? Fran, do you want to go? You went first. That's unfair, but let me ask you.
So I would say it depends on whether you're talking about legal legitimacy or political legitimacy. And yes, there's no doubt that a smaller group, even if you do have like a convention and something that everyone signs, and I can certainly see that some of the types of arrangements that I'm advocating could be open to others. So you could have something like there's an agreement on IT goods and services, and that started with very few countries and now has something like 90 countries associated. But in the beginning, what it did was it looked to the countries that were key in that market at the time. This was like the 1980s. So it was at that time a small group of countries. So I can see a smaller group of countries becoming a bigger group of countries in time. However, I think it's also right that we look to what is feasible and what can our politicians agree to at this particular moment in history. And right now, building on something that will rely on Chinese adherence to rule of law, building on things that require other countries who have not stepped up to the plate, is going to not be so politically acceptable in countries like the United States and in many of the European countries. I hear what Stormy's saying about diversification, and I understand the reasons for not overly relying on the United States with its shifting and challenging politics right now. But I do think that, you know, if there was a way of saying the United States as it is right now that's going to continue to be the politics, I think we would be having a different discussion. I do think that what Russia has done is to create a much greater awareness of the importance of values. And for that reason, having groups of having accords, arrangements, even institutions based around like-minded countries, with others being able to join as they feel that they want to, is something that I think is just the reality of our time, unfortunately.
So a certain degree of openness to others would
Absolutely.
help with legitimacy.
But
Jacob,
I
how
do
do you
think there's a difference. Let me just put one point on it. So when we admitted China to the WTO, there was a feeling that we could get everyone to change by joining these things. That sure, the Chinese were not strict adherents to the rule of law at that time, but they would become stronger adherents to the rule of law by joining such institutions. That has not proven to be true. And the EU has internally seen some of the same challenges as member states have come in and then not adhered to some of the basic tenets of the institution. Not to say that they should be cast out, but everyone is very aware of how challenging and difficult it is to push countries to move governments to move in that direction. And so I think the days of saying the multilateral global system, we're all going to get together and we're going to do this all together. Right now, those are on hold.
Jacob, how do you see this?
No, I agree very much. I mean, I think we are in this sort of critical mass period of trade and economic integration. It's all about reaching a critical mass of producers, countries, markets, whatever, and then move forward. Because otherwise we end up with the curse of 170, however many members there are of the WTO now, I don't even remember. But the EU is having all its internal squabbles with 27. And if you go much beyond that, well, then, it won't work. And we all know that we have issues, be it climate, be it national security, vis-a-vis China, etc., that cannot wait. We gotta move forward, because if we don't, then forces, political views that have absolutely no love at all for the internet or understanding of the international trading system or the liberal economic order, whatever you want to call it, will dictate. So, you know, I acknowledge that, of course, it will be more legitimate if everybody moved in sync, both politically and legally. But I mean, we shouldn't also forget that, you know, when the GATT became the WTO, it was largely because the EU and the US banged a lot of heads together, right? I mean, it wasn't sort of that everybody came along totally out of their own volition, right? It wasn't like that. And then I think, you know, Fran's last point was very important. You know, this sort of political liberalism spillover that, oh, if just people become, I mean, the sort of variation of, you know, Wandel durch Handel, right? I mean, it's dead. We're not giving people the freedom of or the benefit of the doubt anymore. They can come along for their own, out of their own economic interests, but we don't assume that they're going to do that, or we don't set it up in an open way because we assume that they'll all become democracies down the line. Again, that political driver of is dead. So no, I agree with pretty much everything Frank said.
Stormy, do you share this view that we're moving in the direction of like-minded countries working together, maybe with some openness to others, maybe including some headbanging? I mean, how do you see that?
First, I have to say I'm still a very big fan of the WTO, and I'm going to the public forum next week, and I haven't given up on the institution yet. I've always been one of those people who said that free trade agreements, customs unions can go hand in hand with the WTO, and there's also great value in plurilateral agreements within the WTO. And I think this is, we need to keep on pursuing all avenues which we have. And I very much agree with Jacob and Francis. We need to pursue more technical agreements to trade and investment, more technology-driven resource partnership and clubs of the willing in different policy areas. We need to do so. But at the same time, I would say we also need to work in the WTO. And the reason for this is the follows. While for us, trade and services and digital trade has become almost more important than trade and goods, and investment has become more important than trade in general, there are lots of countries out there for whom that is not quite true yet. And for many countries, while for us, trade and agriculture is not the most important thing on the earth anymore, for other countries it really is. And looking at the world and the geopolitical shifts we are seeing, there are lots of countries who are now gravitating between different centers of power. And we have, by far, we have not convinced them that the West with our liberal values is the better choice for them. And we need to offer them something. And that offer lies, among others, in market access for the goods they are producing. And that is goods lower in the value chain, as well as agricultural goods. And history has shown us that trade liberalization in agriculture really doesn't work on free trade agreements. It doesn't, because then, I mean, for example, if you're talking about subsidies with regard to market access or phytos and sanitary regulations, if you liberalize that, then everybody benefits for it. And you want to get something in return, however. So it just, in the bilateral context, it doesn't really work so well. So I would say for these issues, we really, really need the WTO. Fishery subsidies, for example, is a very good example for this, but also other issues. And what I find is that we have lots of ambiguities in our Western trade policy, right? And our rhetoric and our words sometimes don't match up with our actions. I was in India earlier this year when von der Leyen was there in Delhi asking, or with the idea of a TTC for EU and India in her package, but not very much more. And the feedback I got over and over again was, so, but what are you offering in terms of market access to us? You want a lot from us. You want our support with regard to Russia. You want you would like us to also implement sanctions. You want to restart the India-EU trade negotiations, and we should get rid of our stockpiling for agriculture. I mean, lots of wishes we have. And then they look at us and ask, so what can you deliver with regard to market access? And then it becomes very tricky for the EU and for the US, I think, just the same. And I think there we do need, I mean, first of all, be also honest about our own ambiguities. And secondly, I think for that we need bigger arrangements than bilateral ones. And that's why I'm still saying the WTO is very important for some areas, and we need to support it and don't give up on it.
Thanks, Stormy. Let me remind viewers also that if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A button. Let me follow up on that by asking whether you think it would help or it would hurt if the US and Germany and the EU and other like-minded countries became more explicit than when they are going to meet and agree and maybe even set up some kind of institutions together, that these are not about trade, or not, let's say, not only about trade, but should they be explicit and say, this is also about values like climate change. This is also about national security issues. And would that help or would that hurt? I mean, maybe it would help because then you say the WTO that's about trade. We're not going to try to do, we don't want to pile too much onto the WTO. Maybe it needs some reforms here and there, but there are these issues where there's a lot about things that are where economics is part of it, but values and security are there too. And let's be explicit and say we can only do those elsewhere. Would that be helpful, do you think?
So I think that one of the things that has made, where the United States has made its own path more difficult in constructing these kinds of things, the Declaration on the Future of the Internet, for example, is by being so explicitly anti-Chinese. And I think that we need to talk about behaviors and policies that are challenging to the democratic order that we want to preserve and grow, and not force countries to choose between different spheres. In effect, they will. But I don't think we need to make that the headline. I would hope that if we were to create more of a structure around data free flow with trust, that we would eventually bring in other countries, not because they want to jump on an anti-China bandwagon or something like that, but because they see it as being in their interests and providing the types of assurances that they want in order to accomplish their economic and possibly political goals. So, and I think that some of these things are more political than other things. So it allows, some countries will want to join certain parts or certain structures, and others will, and not join others. So I think there's a lot of, in what I'm arguing for, there's a lot of flexibility. But I do think we have to have a positive agenda, not just a negative agenda.
May I briefly jump in there, because this is exactly what Baerbock also said in her one speech on the narrative. She warned, if we are going too much into this narrative, autocracies on one hand side and democracies on the other, and Russia using the same narrative, but against us, so to say, pointing at that we are still have a very colonial thinking in a way. she said that that is going to create lots of problems down the road, that we are pushing away countries. And she rather said we should argue if we want to make a differentiation and distinction, which we have to do, we should look at countries which play by the international rules and respect the international rules and order, and those who don't. And then cooperate with those countries who do, and not cooperate on issues, be more aggressive towards those who do not. And she also warned against making it a China issue only, because there are lots of other countries which fall in the gray zone, so to say. So you have a good friend here in the foreign ministry, Francis.
Well, I mean, I think if I could just, I think we need to be more, quite frankly, I think, well, you've already heard what I think about the Chinese economy. And in a scenario that looks even remotely like that, there isn't going to be two spheres. I mean, China's principal economic and political ally, Russia, is turning into North Korea being turned into North Korea because of its actions in Ukraine. And China itself is going into an increasingly structural, chronic trade surplus simply because of a lack of domestic demand. It's not going to be a very appealing trading partner, quite frankly. And, you know, I think this, just to picking up the Baerbock comment, I mean, what is Xinjiang? I mean, is Xinjiang a matter of playing by the international rules or not? There are those who in China who would argue that it's all about domestic affairs, and it's, you know, you shouldn't mingle it. It's an illusion, I think, to think that way. Just as, by the way, I think, Peter, that saying that we do trade in the WTO and everything else bilaterally or plurilaterally, well, then we're not going to do anything in the WTO. Because one of the reasons that we don't do anything in the WTO is because of labor, environmental, and other concerns that we need to address. Because otherwise there's not going to be political majorities in our countries to do any trade agreements. But fundamentally, I don't think we need to treat a lot of emerging markets and developing countries with kid gloves, because otherwise they go to the other sphere, because it's not going to be there in nearly as much an economic alternative as it may look right now in the future.
Fran.
Just a couple points. Jacob, I was surprised in your discussion of China that you didn't mention the COVID shutdowns, because I think that those are also having a severe effect, not only on the domestic economy, you just mentioned the lack of demand, but companies looking at China as a reliable supplier. I mean, what are you supposed to do now? If because we don't see any sign that the Chinese government is going to change its path on the zero COVID policy. And so then we'll have shutdowns for quite some time in a very erratic, unpredictable way, which is not what business likes. But one point I want to make is that when we talk about constructing something among like-minded countries and hoping that others will come in, there are a lot of countries that are not going to be able to join or not want to join right away. And the value of the WTO in a way has been that it's been so inclusive. And we are seeing a lot of inequality in our own countries, certainly here in the United States. And I fear that although the politics of the current age, to me, dictates that we move in this direction, we have to be careful that we're not creating even more inequality on the global scale. There are going to be a lot of countries that are hit very hard by climate change. And we have to figure out how those who are working in the climate club can help those countries. So I think that I would just put a big hesitation or caution that as we move in this direction, we have to keep our eyes open for how we can help those who are either not ready or not willing, but who are in very dire straits.
Well, we have reached 11 o'clock or gone over, so I will just close by reinforcing what you just said. I mean, my own view is that climate will be the test. If the US and like-minded countries can find a way to balance trade and climate concerns and find a way for that to be reasonably inclusive, while also thinking about how to reform the WTO. I mean, I think that would be a huge win for everybody. But enough from me. I want to thank our three speakers, Fran Burwell, Jacob Kirkegaard, Stormy-Annika Mildner. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. I thought this was an incredibly rich discussion. We will be following up on a number of these issues in the geoeconomics program in the months to come, and I hope you'll be able to join us again for future events. So until then, wish you a good morning and afternoon, depending on where you are. And thanks again for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Thank you.